All right. We are on Rockford Reading Daily, episode 21. Damn, my fault. I jumped the gun like a mug. Episode 21. We are reading Race Matters by Cornel West. We have about a page and a half left of the preface. So let's try to knock this out. And then after knocking this page and a half of the preface out, we'll talk about this, the preface in whole, and then we'll begin on the first chapter. The movement for Black Lives is a grand sign of hope. It is an exemplary collective effort to put prophetic fight back in our bleak movement of imperial meltdown and spiritual blackout. The prophetic vision and social analysis of the movement for Black Lives begin with the most vulnerable, such as the precious LGBTQ people subject to massive trauma and terror. In this way, the terror and trauma suffered by the people in Gaza, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, and India, especially with Dalit peoples, are inseparable from the trauma and terror in Baltimore, Ferguson, Oakland, and Chicago. This intimate connection of race matters and empire matters are accented in the powerful programmatic platform of the Movement for Black Lives, representing over 50 organizations, including such figures as Charlene Carruthers, Alicia Garza, Paul Tomate, Patrice Cullors, Umasela, Niall Fort, the Reverend Osagafayo Saku, Tef Poe, and many others. The visionary platform links the crucial issues of poverty, quality public schools, serious job programs, universal health care, demilitarized police departments, reparations, and strong solidarity with the struggles of peasants in Latin America, Kurds in Turkey, workers in Africa and Asia, Palestinians in Israel, and the Dalits in India. Another sign of hope is the Reverend William J. Barber II, the most Martin Luther King-like figure in our time. His Moral Monday movement and now the Poor People's Campaign is, alongside people such as Father Michael Flegger and his great ministry at St. Sabina Church in Chicago, the Reverend Katie M. Ladd at Queen Anne United Methodist Church in Seattle, and the Reverend Michael McBride at the Way Christian Center in Berkeley, California, the last hope for prophetic Christianity in America. Like the Movement for Black Lives, the March 8, 2017 women's mobilization was a grand sign of hope. It shattered the neoliberal hegemony of the Women's March of January 21, 2017, over the, quote, feminist, end quote, label. In stark contrast to the fashionable corporate feminism, boss feminism, and top-down feminism of the corporate media, the March 8th women's mobilization put class matters, gender matters, and LGBTQ matters at the center of race matters and empire matters. So it shut down workplaces in the United States and Latin America. It put homophobia and transphobia at the core of any serious feminist vision and analysis, along with predatory capitalism and imperialism. The historic moment of Standing Rock, in which indigenous nations came together in a struggle for sacred lands, self-respect, and control over resources, was another grand sign of hope. This monumental coming together of indigenous peoples, echoes of Sitting Bull's efforts and Wounded Knee struggles, fused race matters and empire matters with earth matters. Military veterans and disabled activists of all colors, along with committed ecological activists, came together to stop the predatory capitalist pipeline companies from invading and colonizing sacred lands. In fact, the mounting coalition or solidarity work of ecological mobilizations led by Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein with peoples of color here and around the world is a beacon of hope. The kind of hard-hitting, truth-telling work of Black Agenda Report by Glenn Ford, Margaret Kimberly, Bruce Dixon, Nellie Bailey, Ajamu Baraka, and Danny Hyafong helped to keep alive. Helped to keep alive the Black radical tradition during the Obama years of Black celebration and capitulation. Oh, my fault. I gotta put my glove on. I had to take the glove off to turn the page and throw it back on. My fault. 1 second. Okay. The intellectual integrity of the late great Cedric Robinson, the exhaustive research of Gerald Horne, and the brilliance of Adolph Reed Jr. are three sources of inspiration in a moment of black academic wanderlust. The longevity of the grand James Cone, the greatest liberation theologian to emerge from the American empire, remains a measure of any talk of race matters in our time. In the words of Mumia Abu-Jamal, Chris Hedges, Bill Ayers, Henry Garreau, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and Paul Street, often visible on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! TV and radio shows, bear serious witness to revolutionary politics today. There is a delicate balance between preserving a critical perspective while having access to the academic establishment, as in the serious scholarship of figures like Imani Perry, Farrah Jasmine Griffin, Eddie Glaub, Jeff Stout, Paul Taylor, Matthew Briones, Julius Bailey, David Kim, Trisha Rose, Fred Moden, Lucius Outlaw, Tommy Curry, Keonga Yamada Taylor, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, Lawrence Bobo, Tommy Shelby, Michelle Alexander, and Brandon Terry. The dean of the black academic establishment, Henry Louis Gates Jr. of Harvard University, as well as Minister Louis Farrakhan, Malik Zulu Shabazz, Professor Robert George of Princeton, and Carl Dix of the Revolutionary Communist Party, are dear brothers, despite our ideological disagreements. Since the prophetic fire lit by hope has been so damped by neoliberal chatter about, quote, hope, end quote, I prefer to be a hope rather than talk about hope. Being a hope is being in motion, on the move with body on the line, mind set on freedom, soul full of courage, and heart shot through with love. Being a hope is forging moral and spiritual fortitude, putting on intellectual armor, and being willing to live and die for the empowerment of the wretched of the earth. Race matters in the 21st century are part of a moral and spiritual war over resources, power, souls, and sensibilities. In the face of the American way of war, defeat, destroy, devastate, I have the black freedom struggle and the black musical tradition. I also pull from the rich resources of the LGBT communities, the feminist movement, indigenous people struggles, the environmental justice and otherly able communities, and immigrant rights and anti-imperialist organizations. This moral and spiritual way of war, remembrance, reverence, and resurrection yields a radical love and revolutionary proxy. We remember the great visionary and exemplary figures and movements. These precious memories focus our attention on things that really matter, not spectacle, image, money, and status, but integrity, honesty, dignity, and generosity. This focus locates and situates us in a long tradition of love warriors, not just polished professionals or glitzy celebrities, but courageous truth tellers who fell in love with the quest for justice, freedom, and beauty. And all great love, like John Coltrane's, quote, a love supreme, end quote, is resurrectionary. All great love transforms death into new life, turns your world upside down, shatters callousnesses and indifference, frees you to treat people more decently and humanely, and bids you to choose a life of struggle with a smile and style, and greet the worms after our time in the world with the warm and welcome of, quote, I lived, I loved, I laughed, and I went down swinging like Muhammad Ali and Ella Fitzgerald, end quote. And that finishes up the preface for Race Matters, brings us to the introduction of Race Matters, which have us going back in time to 1993 again. This was the part we just read from 2017. I think the first thing that I want to speak about from this is very similar to the end of Mumia Abu-Jamal's Have Black Lives Ever Mattered, and really was, when you think about where Have Black Lives Ever Mattered was written with Mumia Abu-Jamal in prison, being a political prisoner, one of the things that stands out is the sacrifice that is called upon, that is asked for by Cornel West. The sacrifice to not just talk about hope, but to be a hope. the sacrifice to not just talk about change, but to be a change, to give action to words. And I think we live in a society now where people, because of things like social media and the internet and how often people prognosticate, we have got to a place where people do more prognosticating than they do performing or acting, and we do with people who do more talking than they don't put those same actions or those same words to the talking points that they have. And I think that people have also become convinced that talking is doing something, that just having a belief is doing something. And so when Cornel West calls upon people to go further than just having a belief or just stating a belief, but to give reality to that belief, to manifest that belief in their everyday actions, I think that that is something that, and to understand the sacrifice that comes with that. He talks about even whether you live or die. He talks about, greeting the worms, and I think that that's something that has to be, and how it would, and specifically he talks about how being a hope is forging moral and spiritual fortitude, putting on intellectual armor, and being willing to live and die for the empowerment of the wretched of the earth. And when you think back to where we exist now in humanity, the reason that humanity is not as barbaric as it once was because people died for it. The reason that humanity is not as oppressive and as exploitative as it once was is because people died for it. Now, that doesn't mean that oppression doesn't still exist and exploitation doesn't still exist and barbarization doesn't still exist, but it is not at the same type of extent or inhumaneness that it once was. And even in the places where it may still be, we can see pockets where that has been adjusted. And so the reason that I, as a black man, am not enslaved in this country is because black people die for me to not be enslaved. It's because white people die for me to not be enslaved. It's because women die for me to not be enslaved. It's because LGBTQ members die for me to not be enslaved. And then indigenous people die for me to not be enslaved. When you understand how wars work and all the things that go into movements and how all these things work, that there's not a collective or group that did not have some type of sacrifice in pushing us forward and as a humanity. And so the same thing can be said for the us being some of the protests. Some of the reasons that I can protest in the manners that I can is because somebody had to die for those things. And so for us we can't get to a point where we are so comfortable in enjoying the fruits of of previous generations' labor that we don't have the fortitude to put in labor ourselves that someone else can enjoy the fruits of, because then we get into a place of stagnation, and stagnation does not help the oppressed, it helps the oppressor. Stagnation does not help the exploited, it helps the exploiter. And that the society that we live in is one that breeds stagnation. And again, that's one of the things that I take away from what Cornel West is speaking about. I think another one of the things is, and this happens very common, is when we read Have Black Lives Ever Matter by Mumia Abu-Jamal, he referenced multiple times Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and spoke multiple times about the connections or correlations that the things that he was saying or the observations he was making, how they connected to Michelle Alexander's observations. And I think that as we go through and read Race Matters, and in this preface we see Cornel West bring up Mumia Abu-Jamal, bring up Michelle Alexander. And I don't know that all of these names, I haven't read and listened to all of the names from these people that he mentioned. But I think that putting these names into the lexicon is important to go back to and to draw back from. And so that's another one of the things that I think is important, is to connect how all of these different pieces of writings forms a broad picture of not only the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, but it also lays out the tactics and ideology and a baseline for how we must struggle and combat police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Another one of the things I think is important is the inclusivity, which Cornel West continues to paint all of these things in, to remind people, and I think that we have to do that job of reminding people that it's not simply straight cis black men who have struggled for us to get in this position, but black women and black members of the LGBTQ community, and that we can't do the we can't help the oppressor by doing the work of dividing, of being divided amongst ourselves. And we must understand that we, at the end of the day, the things that we have accomplished as a black people, and people encompasses multiple types of persons. And so I think that is important. I think, and that gets you into the place of understanding intersectionality. And I think the intersectionality that Cornel West brought up with our comrades in Palestine, and our comrades in Latin America, and all of these different people who are in different pockets of this civilization, different pockets of the world, who are oppressed and exploited and are dealt with inhumanely and are brutalized and dehumanized and criminalized and stigmatized, and that it is more of us on this end of it than it is on the end of doing the oppressing and brutalizing and exploiting. And it's only at the point that we form strong connections of solidarity and a strong understanding of intersectionality that we'll be able to have the type of connectedness and power to overcome these institutions and overcome some of these evils and some of these backwards ideologies and thoughts. And so those are all the things that I take away from that preface and all the prefaces in general. I think that one of the number one things that we have to begin to forge is forging in understanding of intersectionality and forging a dangerous selflessness of being willing to sacrifice everything for the person next to you, being willing to sacrifice everything for the community you are from, to being willing to sacrifice everything from for the caste or the class of people that you are from, and that will get us into a place of wielding the type of power that will crumble these institutions, because they are built on selfishness. Okay, introduction. Race matters. Since the beginning of the nation, white Americans have suffered from a deep uncertainty as to who they really are. One of the ways that has been used to simplify the answer has been to seize upon the presence of black Americans and use them as a marker, a symbol of limits, a metaphor for, quote, the outsider, end quote. Many whites could look at the social position of blacks and feel that color formed an easy and reliable gauge for determining to what extent one was or was not American. Perhaps that is why one of the first epithets that many European immigrants learned when they got off the boat was the term, quote, nigger, end quote. It made them feel instantly American. But this is tricky magic. Despite his racial difference and social status, something indisputably American about Negroes not only raised doubts about the white man's value system, but aroused the troubling suspicion that whatever else the true American is, he is also, somehow, black. Ralph Ellison, quote, what America would be like without blacks, end quote, from 1970. What happened in Los Angeles in April of 1992 was neither a race riot nor a class rebellion. Rather, this monumental upheaval was a multiracial, trans-class, and largely male display of justified social rage. For all its ugly, xenophobic resentment, its air of adolescent carnival, and its downright barbaric behavior, it signified the sense of powerlessness in American society. Glib attempts to reduce its meaning to the pathologies of the black underclass, the criminal actions of hoodlums, or the political revolt of the oppressed urban masses misses the mark. Of those arrested, only 36% were black, more than a third had full-time jobs, and most claimed to shun political affiliation. What we witnessed in Los Angeles was the consequence of a lethal linkage of economic decline, cultural decay, and political lethargy in American life. Race was the visible catalyst, not the underlying cause. One second, turning the page, y'all. Okay. One second. Okay. The meaning of the earth-shaking events in Los Angeles is difficult to grasp because most of us remain trapped in the narrow framework of the dominant, liberal, and conservative views of race in America, which, with this worn-out vocabulary, leaves us intellectually debilitated, morally disempowered, and personally depressed. The astonishing disappearance of the event from public dialogue is testimony to just how painful and distressing a serious engagement with race is. Our truncated public discussions of race suppress the best of who and what we are as a people because they fail to confront the complexity of the issue in a candid and critical manner. The predictable pitting of liberals against conservatives, Great Society Democrats against self-help Republicans, reinforces intellectual parochialism, and political paralysis. The liberal notion that more government programs can solve racial problems is simplistic precisely because it focuses solely on the economic dimension. And the conservative idea that what is needed is a change in the moral behavior of poor black urban dwellers, especially poor black men who, they say, should stay married, support their children, and stop committing so much crime, highlights immoral actions while ignoring public responsibility for the immoral circumstances that haunt our fellow citizens. The common denominator of these views of race is that each still sees black people as a, quote, problem people, end quote, in the words of Dorothy I. Height, president of the National Council of Negro Women, rather than as fellow American citizens with problems. Her words echo the poignant, quote, unasked question, end quote, of W.E.B. Du Bois, who, in The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, wrote, "They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then instead of saying directly, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' they say, 'I know an excellent colored man in my town. Do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil?' At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' I answer seldom a word." Nearly a century later, we confine discussions about race in America to the, quote, problems of black people posed for whites rather than consider what this way of viewing black people reveals about us as a nation. This paralyzing framework encourages liberals to relieve their guilty consciences by supporting public funds directed at, quote, the problems, end quote, but at the same time reluctant to exercise principled criticism of black people. Liberals deny them the freedom to err. Similarly, conservatives blame the, quote, problems, end quote, on black people themselves, and thereby render black social misery invisible or unworthy of public attention. Hence, for liberals, black people are to be, quote, included and, quote, integrated into, quote, our, end quote, society and culture. While for conservatives, they are to be, quote, well-behaved, end quote, and, quote, worthy of acceptance, end quote, by, quote, our, end quote, way of life. Both fail to see that the presence and predicaments of black people are neither additions to nor defections from American life, but rather constitutive elements of that life. And then that gets us to a stopping point, and it's a new segment of the passage of the introduction. So I want to take some time to speak on the things that was brought up specifically there. And I don't know if we're going to get through this introduction. I'm going to try to get us through this introduction. But let's, first, I think one of the things that Cornel West, one of the things that first stood out to me when I heard, because I heard a speech from Cornel West before I read any of his literature, but the manner in which he blends culture and politics to diagnose the disease that exists in American society, and specifically in black society, in the black community in the American society. And I think one of the things that I enjoy is that he and Martin Luther King Jr. did this as well, and Malcolm X did this as well too, is that he can't be bought and sold by being a Democrat or a Republican or a liberal or a conservative. Party lines don't guide his ideology or his thinking. And so the same way how he could see the commonalities between Trump and Obama, I think it's important I think it's also important to note the way he compares and contrasts the way that the Democrats and the Republicans view black people in America. And both of them view them as outsiders. They view them as in my opinion, as political instruments, as votes. They're not viewed as human beings. They're not viewed as a community. They're only viewed in how they can be used to either they're only viewed as ways that they can be advantageous to the power structure. And so when Cornel West gives the statement, for liberals, black people are to be included and integrated, and then for conservatives, they are to be well behaved and worthy of acceptance, it gets you into a place of understanding how, in my opinion, respectability politics work. And respectability politics is a black person taking a piece of each one of those and incorporating that into how they handle things. And so black people who look to be included into white society as if that is what constitutes American society. Black people who look to be integrated into white society as if that is what it means to be an American society. And I think one of the things we have to begin to do is to understand that just as American as it was to have slaves, it was also American to be a slave. Just as American as it was to be the person that is beat by police, it's also American to be beat by police. And when you get into a place of looking at it that way, when you don't just view America as the successes, or you don't just view America from the standpoint of who is victorious in America in the moment, but you view it from the full spectrum of the existence in America, it forces you to begin to have to deal with the hypocrisies. And the hypocrisies that exist for the American dream is that for every one American dream, there is 100 American nightmares that fuels that dream. And so once we begin to deal with the American nightmares accurately, and disproportionately black people and people of color are the ones who have that American nightmare. Once we begin to deal with that reality adequately, we can get to a place of absolving of ourselves of some of the negatives that come with those realities. And so as long as we continue to push out people as long as we continue to view America as the people who are free, walking the streets, enjoying, going to the movies or eating at their favorite restaurant, but we don't also include America to be the people who are in prison and jail and inside of prisons, and who are inside of cells for 22 hours out of a 24-hour day. Until we begin to see those people as Americans as well, we won't be able to deal with these type of issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And it's one of the and again, when anything happens here or even overseas, if something happens and a foreign enemy invades or a foreign enemy attacks, the first thing that happens is the victim is painted as an American to tap into your empathy, to make you think that this can't happen to an American. How could something like this happen to someone who is from the same country as you, or who could be your neighbor? But we don't use that same thing when we talk about the amount of people who are falsely imprisoned, or the amount of people who are killed by police, or the amount of people who live in poverty, or the amount of people who deal with addiction issues. It's never however many Americans died from opioids, or however many Americans died from police. It's whether it's black people or white people or poor people, there's a different type of category that you're put into. But I think that when Cornel West does a good job of explaining the importance of us viewing all of these existences and experiences as the full spectrum of American life. I think one of the other things that stands out is how he talks about how the system and how the country tried to bury what took place in Los Angeles, or make it seem as if it never happened, or it never took place, or try to change the narrative on it, or form their own narrative on it. And I think that's something that we've seen take place with not only what happened with the protest after Trayvon Martin and the uprising in Ferguson and Baltimore and New York, but specifically what took place after George Floyd was murdered in the spring and summer of 2020. We've seen these institutions and these corporations and the government try to co-opt this uprising and to try to change the narrative of what this uprising was, and to give definition to something that everyday folk spontaneously created. And I think that with the understanding that what took place after George Floyd was murdered and what took place in the spring and summer of 2020 is not something that is a one-off, with understanding that based on history and statistics that it will be a moment like that again, we have to do the job of understanding why they tried to change the narrative, why they try to co-opt it, so that way we can thwart them from changing the narrative and co-opting it in the future. And what has happened is that specifically in Rockford, we've seen it take place that a movement for Black lives turned into a movement for Black capitalism, or turned into a movement for Black political gain. And that happened primarily because we didn't have strong enough grassroots organizations, specifically here in Rockford, to capitalize off of this movement for Black lives and make sure it stayed being highlighting the hypocrisies of the country, the hypocrisies of the society, and uplifting Black life. And instead, it was used to further marginalize the Black youth, to further marginalize the experience of Black people, and to give a platform to Black elites, to give a platform to Black not-for-profits, to give a platform to Black liberals, Black neoliberals to run for office. And that's something that has been done regularly with uprisings. And so those are some of the commonalities already from 1993 that I think had some precedent into where we are at now. And we're not going to be able to, we had 31 minutes. I want to try to make sure we keeping this to 30 minutes. It's like 6-7 more pages left in this introduction. So we're going to wrap up this Rockford Reading Daily episode 21 of Race Matters right here. Again, we record and put these episodes out every day to give the opportunity to someone to begin on their struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice every day, and to give others the opportunity to further their struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice every day. We want to ask people to please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember that new episodes of Rockford Reading Daily come out every day on wherever podcasts are available. The Social Construct of Leslie comes out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We're going to be working on more podcast content to be putting out, try to get more voices involved. So, again, thanks for taking out the time to listen to this episode of Rockford Reading Daily. Please share this, and we outside. We'll be back tomorrow.